US President Donald Trump has pledged to bring down America's budget deficit. But with Washington continuing to spend more than it collects, the deficit is moving in the opposite direction. National debt has surpassed $40 trillion for the first time. It's more than doubled in less than a decade, taking just 5 months for the total to rise from $39 trillion to over $40 trillion. The increase reflects years of borrowing, including pandemic-era spending, along with higher costs for programs such as Medicare and Social Security. The One Big Beautiful Bill signed into law last year extended major tax cuts and is expected to add trillions of dollars to federal deficits. The war in the Middle East is creating another source of financial pressure. Higher energy prices are adding to inflation concerns, while increased government spending could put further pressure on borrowing costs. But today, one of the biggest drivers of the debt is the debt itself. Net interest payments on national debt have now surpassed annual US defense spending, taking up an increasingly large share of federal revenues. That leaves less room in the budget for other priorities, while higher interest rates make new borrowing even more expensive. Joining us for more is Mark Humphrey-Jenner in Sydney. He's an Associate Professor of Finance at the University of New South Wales Business School. Welcome back to the programme, Mark. So help us understand what the impact this national debt has on US finances.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. And the national debt it's not great for US finances because the higher the US government debt, the more that can potentially crowd out other borrowers, which ultimately can raise interest rates for the rest of the economy. And that ultimately can be bad for economic growth. And it clearly can, to some extent, also have an inflationary impact. Because if the government is going out and borrowing money to spend money, and it spends money inefficiently, well, that ultimately is inflationary. So the government debt is certainly something the government needs to get on top of. And certainly people like Scott Bessent and President Trump himself have flagged the need to rein in deficits, reduce the amount of debt relative to GDP, but still debt is quite high in the US.
And with debt hitting a record $40 trillion, will that finally be a wake-up call for the government to be more cautious with spending?
Well, certainly one could hope so. However, ultimately that's unlikely to occur. So US government debt's hit $40 trillion. I think the real thing to focus on, and the big ticket one, is debt to GDP, because that's also incredibly high and is showing no real signs of decreasing at about 122, 124%, give or take a little bit. And it's remained relatively elevated, even though its acceleration has slowed down. Now, that's really important because if your economy is growing faster than your debt, well, then you're still in an okay situation, even if debt is increasing. But the problem is that's not what is happening. Both debt and debt to GDP are increasing. And with the midterms coming up, it doesn't look like there's much appetite to reduce spending because President Trump and the Republicans certainly want to try to retain some degree of power. And if they cut back on spending, well, ultimately that could cost them votes.
And what does that essentially mean for the bond market? Do investors no longer want to buy US debt?
So investors are still buying US debt. The yields are actually quite attractive to investors, and the spread between US government and US corporate debt has narrowed somewhat. So investors are still quite willing to buy. Obviously, if there's a prospect of a default, that's when investors will start to exit the market and their yields will skyrocket. But at this point, we don't appear to be in that situation. And like I've said, the relatively buoyant yields have actually attracted some passive debt holders into the market. It does, of course, create issues for those in the corporate sector because people investing in corporate debt, well, they have to justify to their clients whether the premium is sufficient to go into the corporate field. But still, at the moment, people are still investing. But the high yields do create issues for growth companies because those growth companies need to access money. And if yields are higher, well, their cost of capital is also relatively higher.
Mark Humphrey-Jenner, great to have your insights. Thank you very much, as always.